I am Tiana, 33 years old, and somehow still recovering from the trauma inflicted by my family. As a successful software developer, I have escaped their toxicity, but I still keep in touch occasionally. Last Sunday, they invited me to a fancy dinner to catch up. Between expensive wine and buttered toast, my sister leaned forward, smirking. Tiana, you know you are so lucky we still have to mention you. Pity works wonders. I just took a sip of coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, deactivated all of the family credit accounts, and emailed the lawyer about selling the log cabin. Before continuing this story, let me know where you started reading in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have ever faced family members who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta meant being privileged to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house, with its neatly manicured lawn and heated pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue, at my mother Valerie's request, despite my preference for green, became my prison sanctuary. From elementary to high school, I maintained my upright character while participating in elite student councils and dealing with their constant rejection. The clinking of silverware against fine china echoed in the grand dining room. My sister Kiara had just returned from 3 years in Europe with her husband Connor. Connor was a white man from a supposedly old money family in New York, and my parents treated him like pure royalty. He sat across from me, swirling his bourbon, wearing a suit that I immediately recognized as a previous season discount rack purchase. Still single, LOL? Kiara asked, her voice cutting through the soft jazz playing in the background. She flashed a perfectly veneered smile, dripping with manufactured innocence. I cannot believe you have not found anybody yet. It must be so lonely in that little apartment of yours. Connor snickered, leaning back in his chair and loosening his silk tie. Hey, ugly, still the same. You would think all that bookkeeping you do would at least buy you a decent makeover by now. Some things never change, I guess. I carefully set my fork down next to my plate, feeling the familiar sting of their cruelty. But the girl who used to cry in her bedroom was long gone. Now I simply looked at them, my expression completely unreadable. Before I could utter a single word in response, my father Harrison stood up at the head of the long mahogany table. He tapped his spoon against his crystal glass, commanding the attention of the room. Good timing, my father said, his voice booming with the authoritative tone he used to run his media company. Since we are all finally gathered here together, I have something important to tell you. As you know, my heart condition has worsened over the past few months. I have decided it is time for me to step down as CEO of the family company. He placed a heavy hand on Connor's shoulder, beaming with pride. I am transferring 80% of my shares in the title of CEO directly to Connor. He has the background, the pedigree, and the vision to take this family to the next level. Kiara will receive the remaining 20%. I looked at my father, waiting for the punchline. And me? I asked quietly. You are unmarried, married, and emotionally unstable, Tiana, Harrison stated coldly. You do not have the capacity to handle corporate wealth. But that is not the only piece of business we need to conclude tonight. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, tossing them onto the table. They slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of my plate. Connor's new venture requires a significant influx of liquid capital to get off the ground, my father explained, adjusting his glasses. I am legally transferring your childhood home, the property your grandmother left exclusively to you, into Connor's name. We are going to leverage it for a massive commercial loan. Sign the paperwork, Tiana. The notary is waiting in the study. The sheer audacity of his demand hung in the air. The house my grandmother left me was the only piece of my childhood that held any warmth. She had specifically put it in a trust under my name to protect it from my father's reckless financial gambling. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice dangerously calm. That house belongs to me. It has nothing to do with Connor or your company. My mother Valerie slammed her hand on the table. Her perfectly styled hair trembled with her sudden rage. You ungrateful, selfish girl, your sister and her new husband need this to secure their future in high society. You are just a bitter, lonely bookkeeper still hung up on the past. You owe this family for putting a roof over your head all those years. I owe this family absolutely nothing, I countered, locking eyes with my mother. You have spent my entire life treating me like an unwanted burden while parading Kiara around like a trophy. Connor is a grown man. If his old money family is so wealthy and powerful, let him ask his own parents for a commercial loan. Why does he need to steal the only property my grandmother left me? Connor's face flushed a deep, angry red, his facade cracking for a single second before he masked it with a sneer. It is an investment, Tiana. Something your small mind would not understand. I understand perfectly, I replied, standing up and smoothing out my dress. I picked up the stack of documents, gripped them tightly with both hands, and ripped them down the middle. I dropped the torn pieces onto my plate. This dinner is officially over. The heavy swinging door of the kitchen closed shut behind me, cutting off the chaotic noise from the dining room. The space was impeccably clean, featuring gleaming white marble countertops and stainless steel appliances that my mother rarely used. I walked over to the coat rack near the pantry to retrieve my cashmere trench coat. My hands were perfectly steady. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, preparing to walk out the back door and leave this toxic environment for good. Before I could reach the brass handle, the kitchen door slammed open against the wall. Connor stormed into the room, his face twisted into an ugly snarl. The charming, polite routine he performed for my parents had completely vanished. He marched across the custom tile floor and planted himself directly between me and the exit, blocking my only path. He leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the marble island, trapping me in the narrow space. The smell of cheap bourbon and desperation radiated off his breath. You really think you can just walk away from this? Connor whispered, his voice dripping with venom. You are absolutely out of your mind. My lawyers will crush you before you even make it to your car. I did not step back. I held my ground and looked him straight in the eyes. Move out of my way, Connor. He scoffed, leaning in closer. The deeply ingrained entitlement he possessed radiated from every pore. Listen to me very carefully. You do not understand how the real world works. People like my family have generational wealth. We have power, influence, and connections that you could not even dream of. You are just a bitter, lonely nobody who got lucky with a grandmother who felt sorry for you. You really think a woman like you can fight an old money family like mine? We will bury you in legal fees until you are begging to sign that house over. The racial and elitist undertones of his little speech were glaringly obvious. He thought his skin color and his fabricated pedigree gave him the right to walk into my family home and steal from me. He genuinely believed I should bow down in gratitude just because he graced my sister with his presence. I looked at his face, taking in the slight tremor in his jaw and the nervous sweat forming on his forehead. Old money, I asked, allowing a slow, mocking smile to spread across my face. I reached out and tapped the face of his watch with my manicured fingernail. If you are going to play the part of a wealthy aristocrat, you should probably be a bit more careful with your leased jewelry. There is a massive scuff mark on the crystal of that Rolex. The rental agency is definitely going to charge you a heavy penalty fee for that damage when you return it on Monday. Connor froze instantly. He quickly pulled his wrist back, instinctively covering the watch face with his other hand. His confident posture crumbled for a fraction of a second. I do not know what you are talking about, he stammered, trying to regain his composure. This is a custom piece. Save the performance for my parents, I said, my tone shifting from amused to completely lethal. Because I happen to know exactly what kind of financial trouble your family is hiding. Your father made 3 catastrophic bets on commercial real estate derivatives last quarter. The hedge fund your family has been bragging about is currently drowning in over $40 million of toxic debt. You are not marrying my sister because you love her. You are marrying into this family because you are flat broke. You need my father to hand over his company so you can liquidate its assets, and you need my childhood home to use as collateral to keep your own creditors from seizing your fake New York estate. The color drained completely from his face. He stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, looking like a deer caught in the headlights. The arrogant predator had suddenly realized he had walked directly into a trap. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely rattled, unable to comprehend how the quiet, invisible bookkeeper knew the exact details of his closely guarded financial ruin. "How dare you speak to my husband that way?" The shrill voice of my sister pierced the tense silence. Kiara pushed her way through the swinging door, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the tile floor. She marched over to stand right beside Connor, grabbing his arm protectively and glaring at me with absolute hatred. She was completely oblivious to the panic radiating from the man she was clinging to. "You are just jealous," Kiara spat, tossing her long hair over her shoulder. "You have always been jealous of me. You cannot stand the fact that I married a successful, wealthy man while you are destined to die alone. You are making up insane lies because you want to ruin my happiness. Mom was entirely right about you. You are nothing but a toxic, miserable failure who wants to drag everyone else down to your pathetic level." Connor quickly masked his panic with a forced, arrogant smirk, emboldened by the blind loyalty of my sister. He wrapped his arm around her waist and kissed the top of her head. "Do not waste your breath on her, sweetheart," Connor said smoothly, his voice dripping with false confidence once again. "She is clearly having a mental breakdown. We will just let the legal team handle her from here. She will be begging us for a settlement by the end of the week." "You are both making a truly terrible mistake," I said softly, stepping around the large marble island to face them. "I highly suggest you move out of my way right now. I am completely finished playing these pathetic childish games with the two of you." Connor stepped back, his false bravado crumbling under the sheer weight of my warning. I did not wait for my sister to conjure another screeching insult. I pushed past them, the heavy fabric of my cashmere coat brushing against the marble counter, and strode straight back into the main dining area. The lavish spread of half-eaten roasted duck and untouched asparagus suddenly looked like a plastic movie set. My parents were standing side by side near the grand staircase, their faces masked in a mixture of disbelief and bubbling rage. They had obviously heard the commotion spilling out from the kitchen. "Where do you think you are going?" Harrison demanded, his voice cracking like a whip across the expansive room. "We are not finished here, Tiana. You do not get to dictate the terms of this family. You do not have the power to walk away from me." I stopped at the edge of the Persian rug, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder. "I already did, Father. I suggest you call your notary and tell him to pack up his little stamp. There is absolutely nothing left for me to sign." Harrison took 2 heavy steps toward me, his face morphing into a mask of pure patriarchal fury. "If you walk out that front door without signing your grandmother's property over to Connor, I will make you homeless by morning. Do you hear me? I will call the management company of that cheap little apartment complex of yours and have you thrown out on the street. I paid the security deposit on that unit 5 years ago. I am listed as a guarantor. I will terminate the lease, empty the accounts, and make sure you do not have a single dime to your name. You will be sleeping in a shelter by tomorrow night." The sheer predictability of his threat was almost boring. He truly believed he still held the keys to my survival. He believed that the $2,000 he threw at me half a decade ago gave him permanent ownership over my entire existence. Valerie rushed to stand beside him, crossing her arms over her expensive silk blouse. "Listen to your father, Tiana. You are being completely irrational and hysterical. We are trying to help Connor build a legacy for your sister. If you ruin this for Kiara, we will cut you off completely. No more family dinners, no more holiday invitations. You will be entirely dead to us. You have treated me like a ghost for the past 30 years. I replied, my voice steady and echoing clearly in the vast, high-ceilinged room. "Being dead to you sounds like an absolute vacation." I unclasped the gold latch of my designer bag. I reached inside my fingers, brushing past my car keys and wallet, until I found the thick, crisp manila envelope I had been carrying around all evening. I pulled it out and tossed it onto the dining table. It landed right on top of the torn pieces of Connor's fraudulent transfer documents. "What is this nonsense?" Harrison sneered, though he hesitated to reach for it. "That is a property deed," I stated clearly, along with a consolidated statement of debt ownership. "You love throwing that apartment deposit in my face, Harrison, but what you do not know is that I bought the entire building complex 3 years ago." I am not a tenant. I am the landlord. But that is just a minor detail. I highly suggest you open the envelope and read the second document. My father glared at me, his chest heaving with indignation. He snatched the envelope from the table, ripped it open, and pulled out the legal papers. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the first page. I watched the exact moment his brain processed the information. The aggressive, domineering posture he had maintained for my entire life instantly collapsed. His shoulders slumped, and his hands began to shake so violently that the papers rattled loudly in the quiet room. "What did you do?" he whispered, the booming authority completely drained from his voice. Valerie grabbed his arm, peering over his shoulder to read the document. "Harrison, what does it say? What did she do?" "I bought your debt," I explained, making sure to enunciate every single syllable. "When your media company started hemorrhaging money last year, you secretly leveraged this estate to keep up appearances. You took out a massive loan from a private equity firm because no legitimate bank in Atlanta would touch your ruined credit score. You thought you were being incredibly clever, keeping your financial ruin a secret from your high society church friends. But you failed to realize that private equity firms frequently sell off high-risk debt portfolios. My holding company purchased your entire debt portfolio 3 months ago." Kiara and Connor had slowly trailed out of the kitchen, stopping dead in their tracks as they listened to the exchange. Kiara looked completely lost, her eyes darting between her husband and our parents. "I do not understand," Kiara stammered, her voice shaking. "Dad, what is she talking about?" "She is talking about the fact that I own this house," I said, turning my gaze to my sister. "I own the walls, the roof, the heated pool, and the very floor you are standing on. You threatened to evict me from my apartment, Father. That is hilarious. Because if anyone in this room is getting served with an eviction notice, it is you. I hold the mortgage to this estate. I control the collateral, and your payments are officially 60 days past due." Harrison stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of a dining chair. He sank into it, his face ashen. He looked like a deflated balloon. The man who had terrorized me, who had belittled my intelligence and mocked my career, was now sitting at my mercy. The entire family just stared at me in stunned silence. The silence in the dining room was so absolute, I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. My mother Valerie was the first to break the paralysis. Her face, usually a powdered mask of southern hospitality, contorted into something vicious and unrecognizable. She lunged forward, slamming her hands flat against the table and rattling the china. "You are bluffing," she spat, her voice trembling with terror and absolute fury. "You do not have that kind of money. You are a low-level bookkeeper living in a shoebox. You did not buy our debt, Tiana. This is just another one of your desperate cries for attention." I did not blink. I leaned back and gestured toward the document her husband was still clutching tightly. "Ask him," I suggested softly. "Ask the man lying to you about your finances for the last 18 months. Harrison slowly lowered the papers, his eyes wide and hollow. He could not even look at his wife. "It is real, Valerie," he croaked, the sound barely escaping his throat. "The holding company listed on the transfer documents matches her name. She holds the mortgage." Kiara gasped, grabbing Connor's arm as if he could magically shield her from their sudden poverty. But Connor was completely frozen, staring at me like I was a ghost. Valerie turned her blazing eyes back to me. The realization that she was no longer the queen of this castle did not humble her. It only ignited a desperate, venomous retaliation. "How could you do this to your own flesh and blood?" Valerie screamed, pointing at my chest. "After everything I have sacrificed for you, we gave you life, we gave you a name, and this is how you repay us, by trying to ruin your sister's future." "You ruined my future a long time ago, Mother," I replied, my voice steady and cold as ice. "I am just returning the favor with interest." Valerie let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed terribly against the high ceilings. She marched around the table, stopping just a few feet away from me. "Your future," she mocked, throwing her hands up in the air. "What future, Tiana? You were never going to amount to anything important. You were always so quiet, so socially inept, so entirely average. You think you deserve to go to that elite university. You think you deserve that massive scholarship fund your grandfather set up for you." The mention of my grandfather's educational trust fund made my blood run instantly cold, But I kept my face perfectly impassive. What are you talking about? I asked, deliberately baiting her into the open. Do not play stupid with me, Valerie sneered, stepping even closer. The scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. You spent years crying about how you could not finish your degree playing the victim because you had to drop out and take online classes. You blamed the economy, you blamed the bank, but you never figured it out, did you? I stared at her, letting the silence stretch, silently urging her to keep digging her own grave. I took it, Valerie confessed, her voice ringing with sick, twisted pride. I forged your signature on the trust documents when you turned 18. I drained every single penny of your precious college fund. Kiara gasped, but she did not look horrified. She looked incredibly nervous. Mother, stop talking, Kiara warned, stepping forward. But Valerie was completely unhinged, riding the high of her own perceived righteousness. No, she needs to hear this, Valerie shouted, waving Kiara away. I took your tuition money to pay for Kiara and Connor's wedding 3 years ago. Do you have any idea how much a society wedding in Buckhead costs? The floral arrangements alone were $50,000. Connor's family expected a certain standard, and your father's business was already struggling. We had to maintain our image. You owed your sister that money. She was marrying into old money, elevating this family while you were doing nothing with your life. The absolute lack of remorse in her voice was staggering. She had stolen my future, forced me to work 3 minimum wage jobs just to survive, and she genuinely believed she was the hero of the story. She thought she was justified in destroying my life to pay for a party. You stole $300,000 from me to pay for a wedding, I clarified, making sure she stated it again. I reallocated family resources, Valerie corrected, arrogantly lifting her chin, and I would do it again. You are my daughter and your assets belong to this family. You should be grateful you could contribute to your sister's happiness, instead of wasting that money on a degree you would never use. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw a glass against the wall like they expected the old, fragile Tiana to do. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was brightly lit, showing an active, ongoing voice call. I really appreciate your honesty, Mother, I said smoothly. I tapped the red button to end the call, pressing keys to save the file. I was actually missing the final verbal confirmation for the wire fraud case. You just provided it perfectly. Valerie frowned, her triumphant expression faltering. What are you doing? I just recorded your entire confession, I explained, holding the phone up for her to see. And that active call you just saw, that was my lead corporate attorney listening in on speakerphone. I forwarded the recording to him just now, along with the bank routing numbers proving the transfer. You did not just steal from your daughter, you committed federal wire fraud and identity theft. My legal team is filing the charges with the authorities first thing tomorrow morning. The bright color completely vanished from Valerie's face. Connor immediately stepped back, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for a hidden exit. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers fumbling over the screen. He turned his back to us, muttering hurried, panicked words into the receiver. My father remained slumped in his chair, completely immobilized by the sheer weight of his financial ruin. Kiara stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing silently. Within 20 minutes, the heavy oak front doors of the estate swung open. Connor had apparently called his parents, Charles and Beatrice, who were staying at a luxury hotel just a few miles away. They marched into the dining room with the entitled swagger of people who believed the world existed solely to serve them. Charles wore a tailored navy suit, while Beatrice draped a cashmere shawl over her shoulders. They looked around our home with thinly veiled disgust, their noses practically turned up at the air they were breathing. What is the meaning of this absolute nonsense? Charles demanded, his voice echoing with arrogant authority. He stepped protectively in front of his son. Connor called us in a sheer panic. He says you are making ridiculous threats regarding the property and attempting some sort of amateur extortion. Beatrice crossed her arms, fixing her icy blue eyes on me. Her gaze swept over my skin and my dress with an uncomfortable, evaluating judgment. We always knew this family was a questionable match for our son. She sneered, her tone dripping with subtle, racially charged condescension. You people always seem to want a handout. Kiara at least knows how to behave herself in polite society. She knows her place. But you are clearly just a bitter, uncultured woman trying to drag a prominent family down into the mud. You should be immensely grateful that our son even associates with your kind. I did not raise my voice. I did not let her microaggressions crack my composure. I just smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made her falter for a fraction of a second. You should really teach your son how to conduct a proper background check before he tries to con a family, I said smoothly. Charles stepped forward, his face turning an angry shade of red. Watch your tone when you speak to us, young lady. We have retained the most ruthless corporate lawyers in New York. We will sue you into absolute oblivion. We will drag you through the courts until you cannot even afford a public defender. You are playing a very dangerous game with people who have generational power. We will crush you like an insect. Generational power? I asked, laughing softly. That is a fascinating choice of words, Charles. It is highly ironic considering your generational power is currently built on a foundation of quicksand and toxic debt. I reached back into my designer bag and pulled out my silver iPad. I unlocked the screen and tapped to open a highly classified financial dossier. I walked slowly around the mahogany table, stopping right in front of Charles and Beatrice. I held the glowing screen up so they could see the bold, unmistakable logo of their own family bank. Your family hedge fund has been bleeding cash for over a decade, I stated, making sure every person in the room heard the absolute truth. You have been desperately trying to cover up massive losses from terrible investments. You sent Connor down here to Atlanta to find a wealthy family to leech off of, hoping to secure enough capital to delay your inevitable bankruptcy. You thought you found easy prey in my status-obsessed parents. That is a complete fabrication, Charles sputtered, though his eyes were glued to the financial charts on my screen. Our bank is a pillar of the financial community. Your bank is a sinking ship, I corrected him sharply. And you have been desperately looking for a bailout. Well, you finally got one last week. A private equity firm swooped in and bought the majority shares of your failing enterprise. They injected just enough capital to keep the doors open, which means they now have total controlling interest over your entire board of directors. Beatrice swallowed hard, her arrogant posture stiffening. What does that have to do with you? It has everything to do with me, I replied, swiping to the next page on the iPad. Because I am the anonymous majority shareholder of that private equity firm, Vanguard Crisis Management. I am the CEO. I am the founder. I am the person who just bought your worthless sinking legacy. The room went dead silent. The haughty elitist arrogance completely vanished from the faces of Charles and Beatrice. They stared at the digital signatures on the screen, their minds struggling to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. You cannot possibly own Vanguard, Connor whispered, his voice trembling with absolute terror. That is a billion-dollar corporate entity. I built it from the ground up, I said, turning my gaze back to his parents. While you were relying on your skin color and your fake old money pedigree to open doors, I was busy buying the buildings you walked into. I own your debt. I own your board of directors. I control your family bank. If I snap my fingers, my legal team will liquidate every single asset you possess. Your summer homes, your luxury cars, your country club memberships. Everything will be gone by Monday morning. Charles opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Beatrice looked like she was about to faint, her hands gripping the edge of the dining chair to steady herself. The powerful, intimidating predators had just realized they were standing in the cage of a lion. You came into my home and insulted my upbringing, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You looked down on my family thinking you could simply use and discard them, but you are entirely bankrupt, and I effectively own you. Charles and Beatrice stood frozen in the dining room, the color completely drained from their usually arrogant faces. The reality of their financial destruction hung heavily in the air. Without uttering another word of their racist insults, Charles grabbed his wife by the arm and practically dragged her out the front door. Connor watched them abandon him, his jaw hanging open in pure shock. I simply smiled, stepped around his trembling frame, and walked out into the cool Atlanta night. I climbed into the back of my waiting Maybach and instructed my driver to take me home. I knew this was not the end of their desperation. People who have relied on manipulation their entire lives do not just surrender when they lose the financial upper hand, they change the battlefield. By Tuesday morning, the digital warfare had officially begun. Since they could not defeat me in a boardroom or a bank, Kiara and Connor decided to attack the one thing they thought I valued most: my reputation. My smartphone started buzzing relentlessly before I even finished my morning coffee. My executive assistant forwarded me a series of links to various social media platforms and local Atlanta blogs. Kiara had posted a highly produced, tearful video to her thousands of followers. She sat on our parents' expensive sofa wearing minimal makeup to look incredibly distressed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. "My sister has completely lost her mind," Kiara cried to the camera, her voice shaking with manufactured grief. "My father is battling a severe heart condition, and Tiana is taking advantage of his illness. She is trying to extort our money, claiming she owns our childhood home and demanding money we simply do not have. She has always been so bitter and jealous of my happiness with Connor. Now she is trying to destroy us just to make herself feel powerful. Please pray for our family during this incredibly dark time." The video went viral within hours across the elite circles of Buckhead. Connor used his remaining connections in the local press to amplify the narrative. They painted a picture of a deranged, jealous woman trying to steal the legacy of a dying man. The comment sections were flooded with people calling me a monster, a gold digger, and a disgrace to the community. They thought public shame would force me to back down. They thought I would crumble under the weight of social pressure, just like I did when I was a teenager. They were severely mistaken. The smear campaign escalated rapidly throughout the week, culminating in the ultimate display of Southern hypocrisy. On Sunday morning, my father stood behind the wooden pulpit of his prestigious megachurch. The congregation was filled with the wealthiest and most influential African American families in the city. Harrison adjusted his microphone, adopting his most pious, sorrowful expression. "The devil works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he operates through our own flesh and blood." Harrison preached, his voice echoing through the massive sanctuary. "I stand before you today with a heavy heart. My eldest daughter has strayed from the path of righteousness. She has allowed greed and jealousy to poison her soul. She has threatened to leave her own mother and me out on the street. Therefore, as a man of faith and a protector of my household, I have no choice but to publicly sever ties with Tiana. She is no longer a member of our family. We hand her over to God's judgment." The congregation gasped in collective horror. My mother sat in the front row, weeping softly into her hands, while Kiara rubbed her back in a display of perfect familial solidarity. They had successfully weaponized their religion and their social standing to excommunicate me from polite society. By Monday afternoon, the professional fallout they had orchestrated finally materialized. One of my highly visible local public relations clients called my office to abruptly terminate our contract. They cited the negative press circulating around my family, stating they could not be associated with someone involved in such messy public extortion. The news of the lost contract immediately made its way back to my family through the local gossip mill. I sat at the massive oak desk in my corner office on the 40th floor, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. My assistant placed the termination letter on my desk, looking deeply concerned about the situation. "Should our legal department issue a cease and desist order?" she asked quietly. "They are actively defaming your character in the press." "Absolutely not," I replied, signing the termination paper without a single ounce of hesitation. "This is exactly what I wanted them to do." What my family and their country club friends failed to realize was that losing that specific client was a deliberate trap I had meticulously set months ago. That client was a minor, heavily indebted vanity project that was actually costing my firm more money than it generated. I needed my family to think they were winning. I needed them to feel invincible, to believe that their high society tactics had successfully isolated and ruined the invisible bookkeeper. Across town, I knew exactly what they were doing. I received a text message from a mutual acquaintance showing a photograph of Kiara Connor and my parents clinking champagne glasses at a luxury restaurant. They were celebrating my supposed downfall. They truly believed they had neutralized the threat. They thought my silence was a white flag of surrender. They assumed that because I had lost a minor contract and my standing in their elitist social circle, my entire corporate empire was crumbling to the ground. I leaned back in my soft leather executive chair. Their celebration was incredibly premature. By pushing me out now, they had completely removed any remaining moral obligations I had toward protecting their public image. They had given me the absolute freedom to execute the final phase of my plan without a single drop of guilt. Exactly 2 days later, my office phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. When I picked up, my father's arrogant voice echoed through the speaker. Harrison sounded remarkably pleased with himself. He truly believed he had broken my spirit. He thought losing one client and being isolated from his congregation had brought me to my knees. Tiana, he began, using a tone reserved for a disobedient child. I hope this past week gave you some clarity. The real world is harsh for a woman without a powerful family. I remained silent, letting him dig his hole deeper. Your mother and I discussed your situation. He continued, mistaking silence for submission. We are offering you a path toward redemption. Tomorrow night is the annual media gala at the Ritz-Carlton. We want you to attend. I raised an eyebrow. Why invite an excommunicated daughter to your most public event, Harrison? Because we believe in forgiveness, he replied, masking his greed. Here are the conditions. You will step onto the stage before Connor gives his keynote speech. You will issue a sincere public apology to your sister, to Connor, and to us for your erratic behavior. After you step off the stage, you will sign the deed to your grandmother's house over to Connor. If you comply, I will personally welcome you back into the family fold. I smiled at the absurdity of his proposal. He offered a ticket onto a sinking ship, demanding I pay with my only remaining childhood sanctuary. He needed the deed to secure the fraudulent loans for Connor, and he needed a public spectacle to massage his own ego. I accept your invitation, I said softly, injecting just enough defeat into my voice to make it sound believable. I will be at the Ritz-Carlton tomorrow night. I will do exactly what is necessary. Good, Harrison replied sharply. Do not wear anything embarrassing. Try to look presentable for once in your life. He hung up. I placed the receiver down and buzzed my assistant. Clear my schedule for the rest of the day, I instructed. Call my personal stylist. Tell her we need the custom gown I ordered last month, and book the glam team for tomorrow afternoon. We are going to a party. For my entire life, my family had meticulously crafted a narrative about me. I was the ugly duckling. I was the plain, introverted sister who hid in oversized sweaters, while Kiara flaunted designer dresses, bought with my stolen tuition money. They weaponized my appearance to make themselves feel superior. Tomorrow I would shatter that illusion so thoroughly they would never recover. The next 24 hours were a blur of meticulous preparation. I was suiting up for a corporate execution. My legal team confirmed that the financial traps were perfectly set. The following evening, my driver pulled the black Maybach up to the grand entrance of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Atlanta. The valet opened my door. I stepped out onto the red carpet and the crisp night air hit my face. I wore a custom-made floor-length gown in a deep, striking emerald green. The silk cascaded perfectly over my curves, featuring a daring slit and an elegant off-the-shoulder neckline. My hair, usually pulled back into a severe bun, was styled into voluminous, cascading waves that framed my face. I wore diamond drop earrings that cost more than the leased sports car Connor parked in the VIP lot. I looked exactly like a billionaire chief executive officer who owned everything she surveyed. I walked through the double doors and handed my coat to the attendant. The grand ballroom was packed with Atlanta's most influential figures. Politicians, business moguls, and socialites mingled under the massive crystal chandeliers. As I walked down the grand staircase, a strange silence began to ripple through the crowd. Heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence. People who had spent the entire week reading Kiara's tearful blog posts stared at me in absolute shock. I did not look like a broken, bitter woman begging for a second chance. I commanded the room with every single step. I spotted my family standing near the center stage. Kiara wore a white, heavily sequined dress that suddenly looked incredibly cheap. She clutched a glass of champagne, her jaw dropping as she watched me approach. Connor stood beside her, his eyes widening as he took in my appearance. He swallowed hard, looking me up and down with intimidation and undeniable regret. My mother Valerie gripped my father's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What is she wearing?" Valerie hissed. "How did she afford that?" Harrison looked completely paralyzed. The script he had written involved a pathetic weeping daughter crawling back for mercy. Instead, a queen had just walked into his ballroom. I glided over to their small circle, projecting absolute confidence. "Good evening, Father," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. "I believe you requested my presence." Kiara glared at me, her face flushing an angry crimson. She looked at her husband, noticing the way his eyes were still lingering on my emerald dress. "You are supposed to be in the VIP lounge reviewing the apology speech I wrote for you." Kiara snapped, her voice trembling with intense jealousy. "Who do you think you are, walking in here like you own the place?" I offered my sister a razor-sharp smile. "I am just following instructions, Kiara. Father told me to look presentable. I hope I did not overdo it and steal your spotlight." Connor quickly cleared his throat, trying to regain his dominant persona. "Let us skip the pleasantries. Do you have the signed deed for the house?" I looked at Connor, then at my father. "I brought everything we need to finalize our business tonight. I am fully prepared to take the stage and give this room exactly what it deserves to hear." Connor smiled smugly, completely oblivious to the massive trap I had very carefully laid. The melodic chime of a silver spoon, tapping against a crystal glass, echoed through the grand ballroom, signaling the beginning of the main event. My father left our tense little circle and made his way up the velvet-lined steps to the main stage. He stood behind a clear acrylic podium, adjusting his posture to project the image of a seasoned patriarch passing the torch. I took my assigned seat at a prominent round table near the front, settling into the plush dining chair with perfect posture. Kiara and Connor sat at the table right next to mine, whispering excitedly to each other while sipping their expensive champagne. The room was packed with the most influential investors, politicians, and business moguls in Atlanta. They had all come to witness the highly anticipated transition of power within my father's media empire. Harrison cleared his throat, his deep voice carrying flawlessly over the state-of-the-art sound system. He spoke about legacy, about the future of corporate leadership, and about his declining health, requiring a fresh, innovative mind to take the helm. He then introduced Connor with a glowing, entirely fabricated list of accomplishments, painting my brother-in-law as a financial prodigy who was going to revolutionize their industry. The crowd offered a round of polite, expectant applause as Connor stood up, buttoned his cheap suit jacket, and confidently strode onto the stage. He looked completely in his element, feeding off the energy of the wealthy audience. Connor grabbed the microphone, flashing his signature arrogant smile. He started his speech with a series of empty corporate buzzwords, charming the older investors in the front row with his practiced old money persona. He spoke passionately about streamlining operations, maximizing shareholder value, and cutting unnecessary overhead. Then the lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly, and a massive high-definition screen illuminated behind him. The title slide of his presentation appeared in bold, sleek letters. He called it the Strategic Restructuring and Capital Acquisition Plan. As he clicked to the first data slide, I allowed a small, knowing smirk to spread across my face. The graphs, the financial projections, and the highly detailed market analysis displayed on that massive screen were absolutely brilliant. They were flawless, innovative, and guaranteed to double the profit margins of any struggling media company within 3 fiscal quarters. Several prominent venture capitalists in the room began nodding in strong approval, clearly impressed by the sophisticated level of financial modeling being presented. Connor paced across the stage like a Silicon Valley visionary, taking full credit for every single metric and strategic pivot displayed behind him. He looked directly at me for a split second, his eyes flashing with extreme, triumphant arrogance. He actually believed he was the smartest person in the room. What Connor and my family did not know was the exact origin of the brilliant business plan he was currently pitching to a room full of millionaires. 3 weeks ago, before I officially moved the last of my belongings out of my childhood bedroom, I deliberately left an old, seemingly discarded laptop sitting on my desk. I knew Connor had a persistent, terrible habit of snooping through my personal things whenever he visited my parents, always looking for ammunition to use against the bitter, lonely bookkeeper he thoroughly despised. I made sure the laptop was only protected by a very basic, easily guessable password. Inside the main documents folder, I planted a highly sophisticated, meticulously crafted business restructuring plan. Connor, being the desperate bankrupt grifter that he truly was, took the bait instantly. He hacked into my old laptop, found the presentation, and downloaded it to a hidden flash drive. Because he viewed me as a low-level, incompetent nobody, he assumed I had simply downloaded a generic template from the internet or stolen it from a junior analyst at my supposedly mediocre job. He never once considered that I possessed the intellect to actually write it. He thought he had scored a massive free victory. He thought he could just slap his name on my intellectual property and use it to secure millions of dollars in investment capital to save his own failing family hedge fund from total ruin without any consequences whatsoever. Connor clicked to the next slide, detailing a complex algorithm for identifying and eliminating toxic debt within the company infrastructure. The wealthy investors were completely captivated by his confident performance. My father sat at his VIP table, wiping away a genuine tear of pride, thoroughly convinced that his white son-in-law was the ultimate savior of his precious legacy. Kiara was practically vibrating with intense excitement, recording the entire presentation on her smartphone to post to her adoring social media followers. They were all participating in a collective delusion, celebrating a massive fraud right in front of my eyes. Connor wrapped up the initial phase of his lengthy presentation, leaning casually against the clear podium. He paused to let the thunderous applause wash over him, soaking in the public validation he so desperately craved. The invisible snare I had constructed was now fully armed and locked firmly into place, completely ready to snap shut without warning. Every single person in that grand ballroom had just witnessed him claim absolute legal ownership of the highly sensitive documents on that screen. As the loud applause began to die down, my father stood up again, grabbing a wireless microphone from a passing waiter. This was the exact moment in the script where I was supposed to be called up to the stage. This was the moment I was expected to beg for forgiveness, publicly apologize for my jealousy, and sign my grandmother's house over to the deceitful man standing under the bright spotlight. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the emerald silk of my custom gown. I picked up my shiny silver iPad from the dinner table, my fingers resting gently on the brightly glowing screen. I was entirely ready for war. My father cleared his throat, holding the microphone close to his mouth. He looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and socialites, his chest puffed out with absolute pride. He opened his mouth, fully prepared to call me up to the stage to perform my humiliating apology. I did not give him the chance to utter a single syllable. I pushed my chair back, the legs gliding silently over the thick carpet, and stood up. I held my silver tablet in my left hand and walked purposefully toward the grand stage. The heavy emerald silk of my gown flowed beautifully behind me. The audience parted like the Red Sea, their eyes fixed on my sudden, unscripted movement. My father frowned, his microphone lowering slightly as he watched me ascend the velvet stairs. I walked directly past him, ignoring his presence completely, and stopped right next to the clear acrylic podium where Connor was standing. Connor stiffened, his arrogant smile faltering for a brief second. He clearly thought I was about to burst into tears and beg for his mercy. Instead, I reached out and smoothly took the microphone right out of his hand. He was so surprised that his fingers simply unclasped without a fight. I turned to face the massive crowd, projecting total confidence and absolute authority. The ballroom was completely silent. Every single guest was leaning forward in their seats, eager to witness the highly anticipated family drama unfold. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing clearly and powerfully through the room. "I want to personally commend my new brother-in-law for that truly spectacular presentation. Connor has just outlined a completely flawless, incredibly sophisticated strategy for corporate restructuring. He spoke about eliminating toxic debt and securing a prosperous financial future. It takes a very specific kind of genius to put together a financial model of that magnitude. I am sure every investor in this room is extremely eager to write a massive check to fund his ambitious vision. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Investors nodded, completely captivated by my unexpected praise. Kiara beamed from her table, assuming I was finally falling in line and publicly submitting to their demands. My mother let out a loud, audible sigh of relief. Connor puffed his chest out, his arrogant smirk returning in full force. He genuinely thought he had won the war. He thought his stolen brilliance had thoroughly intimidated me into total submission. I turned to face him, offering a sweet, razor-sharp smile. However, Connor, I believe you forgot to show our esteemed guests the final piece of your brilliant proposal, I said smoothly. Could you please click to the very next slide on your presentation? I think the investors absolutely need to see your ultimate conclusion. Connor frowned, his eyebrows pulling together in genuine confusion. The presentation is completely finished, Tiana, he muttered, keeping his voice low so the microphone would not pick it up. Go back to your seat and wait for your father to speak. I did not move a single inch. I held the microphone closer to my mouth, ensuring the entire ballroom heard my next words. Please, Connor, I insisted loudly. Show the investors the final slide. Do not be shy about your groundbreaking methodology. If you truly wrote this magnificent business plan, you should be incredibly proud to share every single detail. Several prominent venture capitalists in the front row began to murmur their agreement. They called out, urging him to continue his pitch. The immense social pressure in the room shifted entirely onto his shoulders. Connor looked at the wealthy investors, then looked back at me. He was trapped by his own massive ego. He could not refuse the demands of the billionaires he was actively trying to hustle. He gritted his teeth, raised the small black remote in his hand, and firmly clicked the button. The massive high-definition screen behind us flickered brightly. The beautiful, sleek graphs and financial projections instantly vanished. They were immediately replaced by lines of complex, rapidly cascading green code against a stark black background. The screen looked like the interface of a highly classified government database. Long strings of alphanumeric characters, international routing numbers, and offshore bank account identifiers scrolled rapidly down the massive display. A bright red banner flashed across the top of the screen, displaying the official seal of the Internal Revenue Service. A loud collective gasp echoed through the grand ballroom. The investors stared at the screen in absolute shock. Connor stared at the cascading green code, his face turning the color of pale ash. He frantically clicked the small presentation remote several times, desperately trying to change the slide, but the massive screen remained securely locked on the scrolling data. He slowly looked over at me. As he finally realized his devastating mistake, undisguised panic radiating from his eyes. What exactly is this? He stammered loudly. What on earth did you do to my presentation? I slowly raised the silver microphone to my lips, my voice dripping with lethal satisfaction. That is not your presentation, Connor, I declared proudly, my voice ringing with absolute authority. That was just a digital bait program. When you illegally hacked into my private laptop and stole my intellectual property, you also unknowingly downloaded a highly classified tracking software. The second you opened that file on an unsecured public wireless network, the tracking program automatically initiated. You just gave it full permission to bypass your heavily encrypted firewalls. Ladies and gentlemen, the data currently scrolling across that screen represents every single hidden offshore account belonging to Connor and his bankrupt family. You are actively looking at undeniable concrete evidence of international wire fraud, massive tax evasion, and severe corporate embezzlement. Connor did not just pitch you a stolen business plan tonight. He just publicly and legally incriminated himself in front of a room full of federal witnesses. The entire grand ballroom erupted into absolute, unmitigated, terrifying chaos. Men in expensive tuxedos leaped from their chairs. Waiters dropped silver trays of champagne, sending shattered crystal cascading across the polished marble floor. Several prominent investors scrambled toward the exits, pulling out their smartphones to desperately call their legal teams before the impending federal fallout could touch their portfolios. The luxurious atmosphere of the Ritz-Carlton Gala completely dissolved into a frantic stampede of self-preservation. My private security team stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall around the stage to ensure no one could interfere with my presentation. I stood perfectly still behind the clear acrylic podium, letting the massive wave of public panic wash over the room. I tapped the microphone sharply with my manicured fingernail. The sharp, piercing feedback echoed like a gunshot through the state-of-the-art sound system, instantly silencing the frantic crowd. "Please return to your seats," I commanded, my voice projecting absolute, unwavering authority. "The doors to this ballroom have been temporarily secured. You are all safe from any legal liability provided. You sit down and pay very close attention to the remainder of this financial disclosure." The wealthy elite of Atlanta hesitated, but the sheer confidence in my tone forced them to comply. They slowly filtered back to their assigned tables, their eyes darting nervously between me and the flashing green code on the giant high-definition screen. Connor stood paralyzed to my left. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. He looked like a cornered animal realizing the trap had permanently sealed shut. Kiara was shrieking from the front row, her shrill voice slicing through the heavy tension. "Make her stop!" my sister screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She is ruining our night. This is all a fabricated lie." "It is not a lie, Kiara," I replied smoothly, tapping the silver screen of my tablet. "It is the undeniable reality. You were too ignorant to investigate." I swiped my finger across the digital display. The cascading code on the massive screen behind me suddenly shifted. The chaotic numbers organized themselves into clear, highly detailed banking statements bearing the official logo of the supposedly wealthy family Connor belonged to. "Let us take a comprehensive look at the actual state of the aegis old money dynasty," I announced, projecting my voice to reach the very back of the huge ballroom. For the past 10 years, this renowned family hedge fund has not generated a single dollar of legitimate profit. They lost their entire fortune a decade ago through a series of catastrophic, highly illegal offshore investments. They have been surviving strictly on vanity loans and rotating credit lines, living completely paycheck to paycheck just to maintain the fragile illusion of wealth. Connor lunged forward, desperately trying to snatch the microphone from my hands. My lead security guard effortlessly intercepted him, grabbing his shoulder and forcing him back a step. "You have absolutely no right to display my private information," Connor shouted, his face slick with nervous sweat. "I have every right," I countered sharply, "because you utilized my proprietary software to commit wire fraud, and because you deliberately targeted my family." I swiped the screen again. A new document appeared displaying private email correspondence between Connor and his parents from 3 years ago. I began reading the highlighted text aloud. "Atlanta is full of new money families desperate for societal validation. I found the perfect target. The father is obsessed with appearances, and the oldest daughter is incredibly naive. I will marry her, gain control of the father's media company, and liquidate the assets to save our fund. It will be exceptionally easy." The audience gasped collectively. Kiara physically recoiled as if she had been struck in the face. She stared up at the massive screen, reading the cruel, calculating words written by the man she had proudly stolen from me. Her carefully constructed high society fantasy shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces right in front of her country club friends. She dropped her designer clutch, her hands flying to cover her mouth in sheer horror. My mother Valerie let out a loud, devastated wail, finally grasping the terrifying reality that she had sacrificed my college tuition and my entire future for a worthless orchestrated scam. But I was not finished. I turned my gaze directly toward my father. Harrison was gripping the edge of his VIP table, his face pale and drawn. He still believed he had some semblance of corporate control left. He still thought his personal wealth was safely tucked away. "You handed him the keys to the kingdom tonight, father," I said, my tone completely devoid of pity. "You praised his vision. You trusted his pedigree. But you completely failed to verify his accounting. I tapped my tablet for the final time. The screen transitioned to a live active bank feed showing my father's primary executive retirement accounts. The balance was entirely wiped out. A big red zero blinked mockingly on the display. Beside it, a routing trail showed exactly where the money had gone. Connor did not just intend to steal the media company. I revealed, letting the brutal truth sink into the room. Over the past 48 hours, he used the executive access you foolishly granted him to systematically drain your personal financial portfolio. He siphoned every single penny of your life savings, your pension, and your corporate emergency funds into an untraceable account located in the Cayman Islands. He planned to leave you completely destitute while he boarded a private jet tomorrow morning. Harrison slowly stared at the massive screen, his eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated terror. The intense patriarchal arrogance that had defined his entire existence completely evaporated. He raised a shaking hand to his chest, clutching the fabric of his expensive tuxedo right over his failing heart. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a ragged, breathless wheeze escaped his pale lips. He collapsed heavily into his chair, gasping for air as he experienced genuine, massive life-altering shock. The reality of his financial ruin paralyzed him, but the grand ballroom was vibrating with explosive tension. While my mother hovered over Harrison, my sister finally snapped. The illusion of her perfect marriage had just been publicly incinerated. Kiara let out an ear-piercing shriek that drowned out the murmurs of the wealthy investors. She pushed her chair back violently. She gathered the heavy fabric of her white designer gown in her fists and began marching toward the main stage. Her face was contorted into a mask of unadulterated rage. She looked like a desperate, wounded animal. "You are a lying, jealous monster!" Kiara screamed, her voice cracking as she stomped up the stairs. "You fabricated every piece of this. You hired someone to make those fake bank statements because you cannot stand that Connor chose me. You have always wanted to destroy my happiness because you are an ugly loser who will never be loved." She reached the top of the stage, ignoring the massive screen projecting her husband's federal crimes. She lunged directly at me, raising her hand high into the air. Her manicured fingers curled slightly as she aimed a vicious slap at my face. I did not flinch. I simply stood behind the podium and watched her lose her mind. Before her hand could make contact with my cheek, a figure stepped smoothly out of the shadows. The lead executive of my private security detail intercepted her effortlessly. He caught her wrist in midair, his grip firm and unyielding. Kiara gasped in shock as her forward momentum was instantly halted. The security guard did not hurt her, but he held her arm tightly enough to let her know she was completely powerless. He smoothly twisted her wrist downward and forced her to step back. "Let go of me!" Kiara shrieked, struggling uselessly against his iron grip. "I will have you arrested. Do you know who my husband is?" I let out a slow, dark laugh that echoed loudly through the microphone. "Your husband is a broke, desperate grifter who is about to be indicted for international wire fraud," I reminded her calmly. I gestured for my security guard to release her. He let go of her wrist but remained standing dangerously close. Kiara rubbed her arm, glaring at me with tears of pure hatred streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "You are so blinded by your desperate need for social validation that you refuse to see the monster sleeping right next to you," I said, my voice projecting across the silent ballroom. "You actually believe Connor loves you. You think this was a genuine partnership." I raised my silver tablet, my finger hovering over the bright screen. "You are just as foolish as our father. You handed the keys to our family legacy to a man who secretly despises everything about you. Allow me to show you exactly how your supposed old money prince truly feels about his beautiful wife." I pressed the final button on my tablet. The massive high-definition screen behind me flickered brightly. The damning offshore bank statements immediately vanished. They were instantly replaced by a series of high-resolution screenshots of private encrypted text messages. The ballroom collectively gasped as the glowing green bubbles filled the massive display. While Connor was busy charming our parents and spending your stolen tuition money, he was maintaining a very active, highly secretive line of communication, I announced. These are direct verified text messages between your husband and a woman named Victoria. She is a prominent, incredibly wealthy white heiress residing in an exclusive penthouse in Manhattan. She is his actual long-term girlfriend. They have been intimately involved for the past 5 years. I pointed to the massive screen. Let us read what Connor had to say about his stunning bride, I suggested mockingly. I read the text message aloud, ensuring the cruel words echoed into every corner of the silent ballroom. Victoria asked Connor how much longer he had to play house in Atlanta. I read slowly and clearly. Connor responded, and I quote, "Just give me a little more time to finalize the corporate takeover. This family is incredibly easy to manipulate. The father is desperate for a white son-in-law to legitimize his status, and the daughter is nothing but a clueless, loud ATM. She buys everything I tell her to buy. I just have to smile, pretend I like her obnoxious friends, and sign the papers. Once I drain the corporate accounts, I will file for divorce, take half of whatever is left, and come right back to New York. She is just a temporary stepping stone. I cannot stand her." I lowered my tablet. The silence in the ballroom was absolutely deafening. The cruelty of the text message hung heavy in the air. I looked down at Kiara. The ferocious anger that had fueled her entire existence completely evaporated. Her face turned an alarming shade of gray. She stared up at the massive, glowing digital screen, her eyes tracing the cruel words over and over again, as if hoping the letters would magically rearrange themselves into an apology. But the text messages were permanent. They were undeniable proof of her ultimate humiliation. She slowly turned her head to look down into the audience, desperately searching for her husband. Connor was standing near their VIP table, his face buried in his hands. He did not even try to look up at her. He cowered in his own shame. The realization hit Kiara with the devastating force of a freight train. Her perfect elite marriage was a complete and absolute sham. Her shaking legs completely gave out. Kiara collapsed onto the stage, the white dress pooling around her like a broken cake. She buried her face in her trembling hands and finally, truly sobbed in front of the entire high society. Valerie stared at her golden child crumpled on the floor. Instead of rushing forward to comfort her devastated daughter, my mother looked out at the sea of judging faces. The prominent members of her megachurch, the women from her exclusive country club, and the elite politicians of Atlanta were all whispering behind their hands. The carefully polished image she had spent 30 years cultivating was disintegrating in real time. Her husband was incapacitated in his chair, her son-in-law was exposed as a penniless fraud, and her favorite daughter was a weeping mess on the stage floor. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized control of her actions. Valerie lifted the hem of her expensive designer gown and marched up the velvet stairs. She did not kneel beside Kiara to offer a comforting embrace. She literally stepped right over my sobbing sister to reach the clear acrylic podium. She snatched the spare microphone from its heavy metal stand, her knuckles turning completely white. She tapped the microphone forcefully, desperate to regain command of the narrative before the wealthy investors could reach the heavy exit doors. "Do not listen to a single word this wicked girl says," Valerie shouted, her voice trembling with manufactured self-righteous indignation. "Tiana is a sick, deeply unstable individual. We have tried for years to get her psychiatric help, but she refuses to accept the grace of God. She has always harbored a dark, demonic jealousy toward her sister. She could never attract a man like Connor, so she hired professional hackers to fabricate these terrible, slanderous documents. She is actively trying to destroy a blessed, God-fearing family because her own soul is entirely empty." I stood a few feet away, watching her performance with a quiet, lethal sense of amusement. She was clutching her pearl necklace, playing the role of the pious, suffering matriarch to absolute perfection. Several older members of her church congregation actually paused their retreat, their expressions reflecting a tiny sliver of doubt. They wanted to believe her. They wanted the comfortable, familiar lie instead of the ugly, uncomfortable truth. "Look at what she has done to my poor husband," Valerie wailed dramatically, pointing a trembling finger toward the VIP table where Harrison was still clutching his chest. "She is literally trying to send her own father to an early grave. Tiana is a demon sent straight from the depths of hell to test our faith. She is a manipulative, cold-hearted liar, and everything you have seen tonight is a complete and total fabrication designed to tear down a holy union. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I simply turned my head toward the back of the grand ballroom, making direct eye contact with the lead audiovisual engineer stationed in the elevated sound booth. I gave him a subtle, deliberate nod. He immediately pulled down a heavy slider on his massive soundboard and pressed a brightly lit green button. The upbeat instrumental jazz music that had been playing faintly in the background instantly cut off. For a split second, the ballroom was plunged into total absolute silence. Then a crisp, high-definition audio recording began to play through the massive state-of-the-art surround sound speakers installed across the ceiling. "I do not care if it is highly illegal, Connor." The unmistakable voice of my mother echoed loudly through the ballroom. "Harrison is too cowardly to force the issue, so we are going to handle this ourselves." Valerie froze at the podium. The microphone slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered loudly onto the wooden stage floor. She recognized her own voice immediately. It was a crystal-clear recording of a private phone call she had made to Connor 3 days ago. A call my security team had legally intercepted after securing a warrant based on my initial fraud reports. "Just bring the counterfeit notary stamp to the house tomorrow afternoon." Connor's recorded voice replied, sounding utterly bored and arrogant. "I already found a guy downtown who can perfectly replicate her handwriting. We will forge Tiana's signature on the grandmother's deed, file it with the county clerk on Monday morning, and use the house as collateral for the corporate bridge loan by Tuesday. She is too stupid and passive to even notice the property has been transferred until it is way too late." Exactly. The recorded version of Valerie laughed, a cold, greedy sound that made the entire audience physically recoil. She owes this family for putting a roof over her miserable head all these years. That little bookkeeper does not deserve a house in that neighborhood anyway. We will drain the equity, pay off the wedding debts, and let the bank foreclose on the property. Tiana can go rent a cheap apartment in the suburbs where she belongs. Just make sure the ink looks authentic, Connor. I need this money to secure my position on the charity board next month. The audio recording clicked off, leaving the grand ballroom in a state of absolute horrified paralysis. The elite society of Atlanta gasped in pure disgust. The wealthy church members who had just considered believing her religious defense stared at her with open, undisguised contempt. She had just been caught, in her own words, orchestrating a federal crime to steal from her own flesh and blood, simply to fund her superficial social climbing. Valerie stood frozen behind the podium, her mouth hanging open. The pious holy mask she had worn for 3 decades had been violently ripped away, exposing the greedy, corrupt reality underneath. She looked down at the prominent women from her country club sitting in the front row. They were looking at her like she was a diseased rat. The absolute social execution she had just experienced was permanent. She would never be welcomed in polite society again. Her entire world was completely shattered into pieces. There was absolutely no apology that could fix this damage. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed my mother's recorded confession was suddenly shattered by the distinct blaring wail of police sirens echoing from the downtown Atlanta streets below. The high society guests, already reeling from the scandalous audio tape, turned their heads toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom. Red and blue lights flashed against the expensive glass panes, cutting through the dim, romantic lighting of the gala. Valerie remained completely frozen behind the clear acrylic podium, her eyes wide and vacant as the reality of her impending arrest finally registered. She had orchestrated a federal crime, and the entire elite circle of Buckhead had just listened to her gloat about it. Before anyone in the crowd could process the approaching sirens, the heavy gold-plated double doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were violently pushed open. The polished security guards of the Ritz-Carlton stepped aside immediately, offering no resistance. A highly coordinated team of federal agents marched into the luxurious space. They wore dark suits, bulletproof vests, and serious expressions that instantly commanded absolute compliance. Bold yellow letters, spelling out FBI and SEC, were printed clearly across the backs of their tactical jackets. The wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites parted instantly, clearing a wide, unobstructed path down the center aisle. I stood calmly near the edge of the stage, my hands folded neatly in front of my emerald gown. My private security detail stepped back, allowing the federal authorities to take total control of the room. The lead FBI agent, a tall, imposing man with a severe jawline, walked directly toward the stage. He did not look at the frightened guests or the shattered crystal on the floor. His eyes were locked firmly on Connor, who was still cowering near the VIP table. Connor looked like he was about to physically vomit. He took one trembling step backward, bumping into a large floral arrangement and sending white roses tumbling to the carpet. Connor Hayes, the lead agent, announced, his voice projecting clearly, without the need for a microphone. You are under arrest for multiple counts of international wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Connor raised his shaking hands in the air, his arrogant old money persona completely obliterated. There must be a mistake, he stammered weakly, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. I am the chief executive officer of this media company. You cannot just storm in here. The agent signaled to two of his deputies, who immediately flanked Connor and grabbed his arms. There is no mistake, Mr. Hayes, the agent stated coldly. We have been monitoring your financial activities for the past 72 hours based on a comprehensive dossier submitted by Vanguard Crisis Management. However, we did not actually need to intervene tonight until you made a catastrophic tactical error. When you connected that stolen laptop to the public, unsecured wireless network of this hotel to project your fabricated business plan, you unknowingly activated a highly classified digital beacon. You transmitted stolen proprietary financial data across state lines to solicit investment funds. That specific action triggered an automatic, undeniable federal wire fraud alert directly to our cybercrimes division. You practically handed us the handcuffs yourself. While the lead agent read, Connor his rights, a secondary scene of absolute chaos was unfolding at the back of the grand ballroom. Charles and Beatrice, the supposedly wealthy and untouchable parents of the groom, had quietly slipped away from their table the exact moment the sirens began wailing. They had recognized the sheer magnitude of the financial trap I had set for them. They knew their failing hedge fund was intimately connected to their son's illegal activities. Desperate to avoid public humiliation, they abandoned Connor entirely and attempted to sneak out through the discreet swinging doors that led to the catering kitchens. They did not make it very far. As Charles pushed open the heavy wooden door, hoping to slip into the service elevator, he was immediately intercepted by a team of SEC investigators and local Atlanta police officers. The authorities had locked down every single exit of the hotel before entering the ballroom. Beatrice let out a shrill, undignified scream as an officer firmly grabbed her arm. She dropped her expensive cashmere shawl, her face twisting in pure, unadulterated panic. "Unhand me this instant!" Beatrice shrieked, struggling uselessly against the officer's firm grip. "We are prominent citizens of New York. We have powerful lawyers who will destroy your careers. We had absolutely nothing to do with whatever our son was doing down here in Georgia." "Save it for the judge, ma'am," the officer replied calmly, pulling her arms behind her back. "We have extensive digital records proving you directly received over $3 million in stolen retirement funds from Harrison's corporate accounts just yesterday morning." The officers escorted Charles and Beatrice back into the main ballroom, parading them directly past the wealthy guests they had previously insulted and belittled. The timing could not have been more perfect. The local Atlanta press, who had been officially invited by my father to document the glorious transition of power, immediately swarmed the disgraced family. Flashing camera bulbs illuminated the grand ballroom like aggressive lightning strikes. Journalists shouted questions, shoving recording devices toward the humiliated in-laws. Charles tried to hide his face behind his shoulder, but the bright flashes caught every bead of sweat on his red, panicked forehead. The harsh, cold metal of the handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, a sound that cut right through the frantic noise of the crowd. Beatrice was weeping openly, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. The arrogant, elitist predators who had mocked my skin color and my upbringing were now being publicly marched out of the Ritz-Carlton in chains. Their fraudulent empire was finished permanently, absolutely. Connor watched the heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom swing shut behind his disgraced parents. The arrogant shield he had worn since the day he married into my family shattered instantly. He was completely alone. The lead federal agent tightened the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists, jerking him forward. The physical reality of federal prisons suddenly crashed down upon him. Connor stumbled over his own feet, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the spilled champagne and crushed roses scattered across the floor. He looked around the room, his eyes darting past the flashing cameras of the local press and the disgusted faces of the investors. He knew his parents could not save him. He knew his fake pedigree meant nothing to the federal authorities. Desperation took control of his mind. He was a coward, and cowards always look for someone else to take the fall. "Wait!" Connor screamed, digging his heels into the carpet to stop the agent from moving him. "You do not understand. I am not the mastermind behind this operation. I am just a pawn. They made me do it." He twisted his body around, raising his cuffed hands to point at the VIP table where my father was gasping for air. It was Harrison. He orchestrated the entire financial fraud. His media company has been bankrupt for 2 years. He begged me to find a way to illegally liquidate the corporate retirement accounts. I was just following his direct orders. The federal agent paused, raising an eyebrow as Connor voluntarily began spewing confessions in front of reporters. Connor did not stop there. He turned his tear-filled eyes toward my mother, who was standing paralyzed behind the clear podium. "And Valerie is the one who planned the real estate theft. She called me 3 days ago and demanded I find a forger. She wanted to steal Tiana's house to pay off her massive social debts. I have the voice recordings on my phone to prove it. I will give you everything. I will testify against all of them. Just give me an immunity deal right now." My father suddenly found his voice. The sheer audacity of his prized son-in-law throwing him to the wolves injected a burst of adrenaline into his failing heart. Harrison gripped the edge of his table, hauling himself up on shaking legs. "You lying, deceitful parasite!" Harrison roared, spit flying from his mouth. "You came into my home and promised to elevate our social standing. You told me your family had billions in reserve capital. You manipulated my entire board of directors and tricked me into granting you full executive access to our corporate accounts. You stole my retirement funds to save your own bankrupt family. I had no idea you were wiring that money to the Cayman Islands. You ruined my legacy." Harrison pointed a trembling finger at the federal agents. "Arrest him. Lock him away for the rest of his life. He is a predator who preyed on a sick man." Valerie abandoned her position at the podium and rushed down the velvet stairs. The pious mother routine was gone, replaced by a vicious street-level fury she usually kept hidden from her country club friends. She marched right up to Connor, ignoring the federal agents entirely. "How dare you blame me for your disgusting criminal behavior?" Valerie shouted, her face inches from his chest. "You brought the counterfeit notary stamp into my house. You are the one who preyed on my daughter and used our family name to legitimize your fraudulent business deals. We welcomed you with open arms. We paid for your lavish wedding because your fake aristocratic parents claimed their assets were tied up in European trusts. You are nothing but a cheap, worthless con artist." The chaotic shouting finally roused Kiara from her state of humiliation. She lifted her head from the wooden stage floor, her tear-streaked face a mess of ruined makeup and pure hatred. She scrambled to her feet, the heavy white sequins of her designer gown tearing as she tripped over the hem. She charged at her husband, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You never loved me!" Kiara shrieked, her voice echoing violently through the grand ballroom. "You slept with that white heiress in New York our entire marriage. You called me a loud ATM. You used my body and my bank account while laughing behind my back." She lunged at him, swinging her fists wildly. "I hate you. I hate you. I hope you rot in federal prison." Connor dodged her clumsy attack, sneering at her with unadulterated disgust. "You really thought a guy like me would settle for a spoiled, uneducated brat like you?" Connor yelled back, his true nature completely exposed for the world to witness. "You were nothing but an easy target, Kiara. You were so desperate for a ring and a fancy last name that you never questioned where the money was coming from. You happily spent thousands of dollars every single week while your own father was drowning in corporate debt. You are just as selfish and greedy as your mother. You deserve exactly what is coming to you. I stood silently at the edge of the grand stage, my hands resting calmly against the smooth silk of my custom gown. I did not need to say a single word. I did not need to defend myself. I just stood right there and watched the perfect family completely cannibalize each other. They were tearing each other apart like a pack of starving wolves. The wealthy investors and church members watched the horrific spectacle in absolute silence, their faces pale with shock and disgust. The local Atlanta press corps captured every moment, their cameras flashing rapidly to document the total collapse of the mighty dynasty. The federal agents simply stood back and let them scream, taking notes as they confessed to federal crimes on the record. My revenge was absolutely complete. The chaotic spectacle on the stage eventually forced the lead federal agent to intervene. He signaled his deputies, who swiftly moved forward to separate the screaming family members. They grabbed Connor by the arms and dragged him down the velvet stairs, his expensive shoes scuffing against the ruined floor. Two other agents approached my parents. The harsh reality of the situation finally seemed to pierce through the adrenaline fueling my father. As an officer placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and informed him he was being detained for questioning regarding the corporate embezzlement and wire fraud, the remaining color drained entirely from his face. His knees buckled slightly, but the agent held him upright. Harrison whipped his head around frantically, his wide eyes scanning the grand ballroom until they locked onto me. I was still standing perfectly still near the edge of the stage, my expression completely impassive. Desperation completely overrode his pride. The domineering patriarch, who had spent his entire life controlling everyone around him, was suddenly reduced to a terrified, helpless old man facing a federal indictment. "Tiana!" Harrison shouted, his voice cracking horribly as the agent began to march him toward the exit. He dug his heels into the thick carpet, resisting the forward momentum. "Tiana, you have to stop this right now. Tell these agents to release me. You need to call your bank and post my bail immediately. I am your father. You owe me your absolute loyalty. You cannot just stand there and let them drag your own flesh and blood away in chains." His demand echoed loudly across the silent ballroom. Even in the absolute lowest moment of his life, facing imminent incarceration, he still believed he held supreme authority over my finances. He genuinely expected the daughter he had abused, belittled, and attempted to rob just minutes ago to suddenly open her checkbook and save his prestigious reputation. I did not move a single muscle. I simply looked at him with an icy, unyielding stare. "I owe you absolutely nothing, Harrison," I replied, my voice projecting clearly over the murmurs of the remaining crowd. "And even if I possessed a single ounce of pity for you, I could not pay your bail, because you have absolutely nothing left to salvage." I raised my hand and gestured toward the heavy double doors at the back of the room. My elite team of corporate attorneys, dressed in immaculate, tailored black suits, marched down the center aisle. They moved with precise, intimidating synchronization. My lead attorney, Marcus, held a thick leather binder tightly against his chest. He bypassed the local press and walked directly up to my father. The federal agent paused, allowing the lawyer to step into my father's personal space. Marcus smoothly pulled a crisp, heavily stamped legal document from his binder and pressed it firmly against Harrison's chest. My father instinctively grabbed the paper, his hands shaking violently as he stared down at the bold red text printed across the top. "That is a federal injunction, Father," I explained, stepping closer to the edge of the stage so he could hear every single devastating syllable. "It was officially signed and executed by a federal judge exactly 1 hour ago. Did you really think I would just buy your corporate debt and leave the company intact? You fundamentally misunderstood the entire scope of my retaliation. I did not just acquire the massive toxic debt of your failing media empire. I actively weaponized it. When you defaulted on your loan payments this morning, my crisis management firm initiated an immediate, aggressive, hostile takeover." Harrison stared at the document, his lips moving silently as he read the catastrophic legal jargon. "You dissolved the company," he whispered, his voice sounding incredibly hollow and weak. "You liquidated everything. I liquidated every single tangible asset, I confirmed proudly. I sold off your broadcast towers, your office buildings, and your equipment. I completely dismantled the company you spent 30 years building to feed your massive ego. I executed a total corporate dissolution to aggressively recoup the $300,000 of college tuition money. Valerie confessed to stealing from me, along with a decade of compounding interest and punitive damages. Furthermore, I seized the remaining equity to recover the financial damages you caused by attempting to fraudulently leverage my grandmother's estate. The court agreed that your actions constituted a severe breach of fiduciary duty and criminal conspiracy. Valerie, who was being handcuffed by a female agent a few feet away, let out a loud, agonizing wail. She slumped toward the floor, dragging the agent down with her. Kiara just sat on the stage, completely unresponsive, her eyes staring blankly at the wall. You have absolutely $0 to your name, Harrison. I continued, delivering the final fatal blow to his arrogant existence. Your personal bank accounts are completely frozen by the federal government pending the embezzlement investigation. Your corporate accounts no longer exist because your company has been legally erased from the earth. The luxury cars you leased have already been repossessed. The expensive country club memberships you cherished have been permanently canceled due to lack of payment. You do not have a single penny left to hire a decent defense attorney, let alone post a massive federal bail. You are going to sit in a cold concrete holding cell tonight, entirely bankrupt and totally disgraced, in front of the exact high society you worshipped. Harrison looked around the grand ballroom. The wealthy politicians and prominent church members he had tried to impress his entire life were looking at him with absolute, unfiltered disgust. His entire grand legacy was permanently reduced to worthless ashes. The federal agent firmly grabbed his arm again, turning him toward the exit. My disgraced father did not fight back against them this time. He slowly lowered his head, utterly defeated, and allowed the authorities to march him out the door. The arrogant, manipulative patriarch was finally and completely broken forever, leaving no trace. The heavy double doors of the grand ballroom swung shut behind the federal agent, sealing the fate of the man who had tormented me for 3 decades. The once vibrant, luxurious space suddenly felt like a massive abandoned tomb. The elite investors, high society socialites, and prominent church leaders did not linger to offer their sympathies. They fled the Ritz-Carlton as quickly as their expensive designer shoes could carry them. Nobody wanted to be photographed near the radioactive remains of a disgraced, bankrupt dynasty. The local Atlanta press corps packed up their heavy camera equipment, rushing back to their newsrooms to publish the explosive story of the century. The catering staff quietly disappeared into the service corridors, leaving behind overturned tables, shattered crystal champagne flutes, and trampled white roses scattered across the expensive carpet. My private security detail remained standing in a perfect, intimidating perimeter around the stage, ensuring I was completely insulated from the physical wreckage. I stood near the clear acrylic podium, breathing in the quiet, pristine air of absolute victory. My emerald silk gown rustled softly as I finally shifted my weight. The symphony of sirens outside the hotel slowly faded into the distance as the police cruisers transported my parents and my thieving brother-in-law to a federal holding facility. Only one person from my former family remained in the devastated ballroom. Kiara was still sitting exactly where she had collapsed on the wooden stage floor. Her heavy sequined white dress was torn at the seams and stained with spilled wine. The false crown of elitist supremacy she had worn her entire life had been violently ripped from her head. She watched the last few journalists exit the room, her wide, bloodshot eyes frantically searching the empty space for a savior who simply did not exist. Connor had publicly humiliated her, completely drained her bank accounts, and explicitly confessed to never loving her. Her father was penniless and headed for a prison cell. Her mother was facing serious felony charges for attempting to forge property deeds. The powerful aristocratic in-laws she had bragged about for 3 years were currently sitting in the back of a police van in handcuffs. Kiara was entirely alone. The realization of her absolute isolation washed over her pale face. She wrapped her arms around her trembling shoulders, shivering under the bright stage lights. The golden child of the family had been stripped of her wealth, her status, and her dignity in a single evening. She slowly turned her head and looked up at me. Thick, dark streaks of ruined mascara ran down her cheeks, staining her neck and the collar of her ruined designer gown. She dragged herself across the polished wooden floor, her expensive dress scraping against the rough stage surface. She stopped just a few inches from my matching emerald heels. She did not try to slap me this time. She did not scream or hurl racist, classist insults at my appearance. Instead, she reached out with trembling, manicured hands and desperately grabbed the hem of my dress. She looked up at me from her knees, her face twisted in pure, pathetic agony. "Tiana, please." Kiara sobbed, her voice a desperate, gravelly whisper. "You have to help me. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. The federal agents seized our primary bank accounts this morning. I tried to use my black card to book a hotel room while you were talking to Dad, but the transaction was declined. Connor used our residential estate as collateral for his toxic hedge fund debts. The bank is foreclosing on my house tomorrow. I do not have a single dollar to my name. I cannot sleep on the street. We are sisters. We share the exact same blood. You cannot just leave me here with absolutely nothing." I looked down at the weeping, broken woman clinging to my dress. I felt absolutely no pity, no remorse, and no residual sisterly obligation. I reached down and firmly pried her trembling fingers off my expensive silk gown. I took a deliberate step back, forcing her to look up at me from the lowest possible vantage point. "You stood in my dining room just 3 hours ago and laughed while your grifter husband called me an ugly, miserable failure," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and echoing loudly through the empty ballroom. "You happily watched our mother confess to stealing my college tuition money to fund your lavish lifestyle. You were perfectly willing to let them steal my childhood home just so you could maintain your fake social status in Buckhead. You never once treated me like a sister when you thought you were winning." I tilted my head, offering her the exact same condescending manufactured smile she had given me at the dinner table. "Still the same, Kiara?" I asked, laughing softly at her pathetic state. "LOL." Kiara gasped, her mouth falling open as my words struck her like a physical blow. The absolute finality of her rejection sank in. She curled into a tight ball on the floor, weeping hysterically into her hands. I did not waste another second looking at her. I turned my back on the shattered remnants of my abusive family and walked purposefully down the velvet stairs. My security team instantly fell into formation around me, escorting me across the ruined ballroom floor. I pushed open the heavy gold doors and stepped out into the crisp, refreshing Atlanta night. My driver was waiting by the curb, holding the door to my black Maybach open. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, smoothing my emerald gown. The driver closed the door, sealing me inside my quiet, impenetrable sanctuary. "Take me to the new penthouse," I instructed clearly. The powerful engine purred to life, and the Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb. I looked out the tinted window, watching the Ritz-Carlton fade into the distance. The chains of my past were permanently broken. I was entirely free. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of my new penthouse, casting a warm glow over the marble floors. I stood by the glass, coffee in hand, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. The city was buzzing with the explosive financial scandal, and I was the orchestrator who had pressed the detonation button. I picked up the silver remote, clicking on the flat-screen television. Every news network was dominated by the fall of Connor and his aristocratic family. The screen flashed an image of Charles and Beatrice being walked out of their New York estate. Federal agents carried heavy boxes of seized financial documents, gutting the mansion they had fraudulently maintained. The anchor detailed the sheer magnitude of their international wire fraud and the evaporation of their fake hedge fund. The coverage shifted to Harrison. The broadcast displayed the heavy iron gates of his former media company being padlocked by federal bank officials. The reporter confirmed the corporation had been legally dissolved, its assets liquidated to satisfy massive corporate debts. The financial ruin was only the beginning of his absolute humiliation. The anchor announced that the board of directors at his megachurch had held an emergency midnight vote. Harrison had been formally excommunicated from the congregation he once ruled with an iron fist. He was stripped of his holy titles and banished from polite society. I took a satisfying sip of my coffee. The public destruction of the people who had abused me was unfolding with undeniable precision, but the ultimate triumph was yet to arrive. My smartphone buzzed on the glass table. It was a message from my assistant containing a highly anticipated link. Forbes magazine had published their new monthly issue. I tapped the link and the digital cover loaded instantly on my screen. There I was, staring back at myself. The photograph had been taken in my corner office at Vanguard Crisis Management. I wore a tailored charcoal suit looking serene and powerfully authoritative. The bold text across the cover read, "The Invisible Empire, How Tiana Built a Billion-Dollar Crisis Management Firm in Absolute Secrecy." The feature article was a masterclass in strategic public relations. It systematically stripped away the false narrative my family had desperately tried to construct around me. The journalist detailed my journey from a dropout to the founder of one of the most successful private equity firms on the East Coast. The article explicitly outlined how I orchestrated the corporate takeover of the failing bank owned by Connor's family, proving my financial supremacy. The contrast between my massive success and my family's criminal downfall was stark and deeply satisfying. Within 30 minutes of the article dropping, my phone began ringing incessantly. The same elite socialites and hypocritical church members who participated in my public shaming a week ago were desperately scrambling to get back into my good graces. They realized they had aligned themselves with a sinking ship while mocking the captain of a luxury yacht. My assistant transferred a persistent caller directly to my secure line. I answered the call, recognizing the voice immediately. It was the CEO of the public relations firm that abruptly terminated my contract during Kiara's smear campaign. "Tiana, good morning," the executive began, his voice dripping with forced enthusiasm. "I just read the incredible Forbes feature. We are all deeply impressed by your massive accomplishments. I wanted to personally reach out and apologize for the misunderstanding last week. We would be absolutely honored to reinstate our contract with Vanguard Crisis Management immediately. In fact, we are willing to double our previous retainer." I let him ramble for a few seconds, savoring the desperation in his voice. He was terrified I would use my public platform to expose his company for their poor judgment. "There was no misunderstanding," I replied, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "You made a calculated business decision based on the fabricated lies of a desperate, unemployed woman. You proved that your firm lacks basic investigative skills and loyalty. Vanguard does not partner with cowardly, reactive organizations. Your contract remains permanently terminated. Do not ever call this number again." I hung up the phone, feeling a surge of power. I did not just survive their attempts to destroy me, I thrived in the environment they used against me. The media frenzy continued to escalate throughout the afternoon. Kiara, unable to accept her new reality, attempted to launch a sudden counter-offensive. She logged onto her social media accounts, going live to claim the Forbes article was a paid stunt. She was desperately clinging to the fading illusion of her relevance. I did not even have to lift a finger to destroy her final attempt at manipulation. The internet had already turned on her completely. Her comment section was instantly flooded by users mocking her torn dress at the gala, posting screenshots of Connor's cruel text messages, calling her a clueless cash machine, and demanding she explain her involvement in the mortgage fraud. The public backlash was so severe that Kiara was forced to permanently delete all of her social media accounts within 2 hours. Her digital empire, built entirely on vanity and stolen money, was completely erased from existence. I walked back over to the windows of my penthouse, looking down at the bustling city below. I had excised the cancer from my daily life. I had reclaimed my stolen assets, multiplied them exponentially, and secured my legacy on my own terms. My name was no longer a joke whispered at elitist dinner tables. It was a standard of absolute excellence and untouchable power. There was one final piece of business I needed to conclude before I could close this dark chapter of my life forever. My assistant buzzed the intercom, confirming that the security clearance I requested earlier that morning had been officially approved by federal authorities. I walked over to the entryway, grabbing my cashmere coat and designer purse. I was heading to a federal holding facility. The drive to the federal holding facility took less than 40 minutes, but the transition was incredibly jarring. I stepped out of the Maybach and looked up at the bleak concrete fortress looming against the gray afternoon sky. The heavy glass doors slid open, pulling me into a sterile, unwelcoming lobby that smelled sharply of industrial bleach and stale coffee. I bypassed the waiting area, presenting my legal clearance to the armed guard. As a chief executive actively assisting the investigation, my visitation request was expedited immediately. A female guard patted down my cashmere coat, confiscated my designer purse, and escorted me down the echoing corridors. Fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, casting an unforgiving, sickly pale glow on the heavy steel doors. We finally arrived at the secure visitation wing. The guard unlocked a metal door and directed me to a private booth. A thick pane of reinforced plexiglass divided the room entirely in half. I sat down on the hard plastic chair, smoothing my skirt, and waited for my disgraced brother-in-law to appear. Minutes later, the steel door on the opposite side rattled loudly. Connor shuffled into the room, escorted by a towering corrections officer. The visual transformation of the arrogant predator was spectacular to witness. Gone were the tailored suits and the styled hair he used to charm my parents. Connor was draped in a baggy bright orange jumpsuit that hung awkwardly on his frame. His hair was a greasy mess, and heavy bags hung beneath his bloodshot eyes. The reality of federal incarceration had stripped away every ounce of his fabricated superiority. He looked exactly like what he was, a cheap, desperate grifter at the end of the line. Connor sat down heavily on his plastic chair. He stared at me through the scratched glass, his eyes filled with a frantic energy. He slowly picked up the black telephone receiver attached to the concrete wall. I picked up my matching black receiver and held it casually to my right ear. I did not say a single word. I waited for him to initiate his inevitable performance. Tiana. Connor breathed into the phone, his voice dripping with a sickening manufactured sweetness. He attempted his signature smile, but his trembling lips ruined the effect. I knew your forgiving heart would not leave me rotting in this terrible place. This entire situation is a catastrophic misunderstanding. They were completely bankrupt and forced me to target your family. They manipulated my loyalty to save our legacy. He leaned closer to the glass, pressing his free hand against the thick barrier. Harrison and Valerie created the toxic environment that drove me to desperate measures. They belittled you, and they practically threw Kiara at me to secure their social standing. I was just a victim of their elitist ambition. Connor paused, lowering his voice to a hushed whisper. He was bringing out his ultimate weapon of manipulation. I never actually loved Kiara. You have to know that. She was just a loud, obnoxious distraction. Every single time I looked at her, I was secretly wishing she was you. You are the powerful, brilliant woman who built an empire from absolutely nothing. I was always deeply in love with you, Tiana. If you get me an immunity deal, we can finally be together. We can combine our resources and rule the financial world. I will spend my entire life making you happy. I sat still, listening to the garbage spilling from his mouth. He genuinely thought I was a desperate woman who would melt at his affection. He thought he could flatter his way out of federal prison. Are you finished talking, Connor? I asked, my voice cold and entirely devoid of human emotion. Connor blinked, his desperate smile faltering. Tiana, please. I am pouring my heart out to you. You do not have a heart, I replied sharply. You only have a calculator. And unfortunately for you, your final equation is fatally flawed. I reached down to the small metal tray where the guard had placed my approved items. I picked up a single glossy 8x10 photograph. I raised my hand and pressed the vibrant image flat against the thick plexiglass. Connor stared at the photograph and his entire world collapsed. The picture showed his secret mistress, Victoria, the prominent heiress from New York. She was sitting comfortably in a federal interrogation room, surrounded by stern government agents. Victoria was smiling pleasantly as she handed heavily documented financial ledgers directly to the lead prosecutor. You thought you were the smartest predator in the room, I explained, watching the color drain from his face. But Victoria values her own freedom far more than a broke, incarcerated boyfriend. When my firm anonymously sent her the evidence of your fraud, she immediately contacted her legal team. She walked into the local field office and cut a plea deal to secure her immunity. She handed over every offshore bank account number, encrypted password, and digital correspondence linking you to the embezzlement. She threw you under the bus to save her own skin. Connor dropped the phone receiver. It slammed against the concrete wall and dangled by its metal cord. He pressed both of his trembling hands against the cold glass, his mouth opening in a wide, silent, horrified scream of pure defeat. His smug, manipulative arrogance was permanently obliterated. He was permanently trapped inside a federal cage, completely and utterly abandoned by his disgraced parents, his furious wife, and his deceitful mistress. He finally realized that he had absolutely no one left in the entire world to con or manipulate. I slowly placed the black telephone receiver back onto its metal cradle with a definitive, highly satisfying click. I smoothly picked up my glossy photograph, stood up tall, and turned my back on his pathetic, weeping reflection. I walked out of the sterile, depressing visitation room without ever looking back, striding confidently back toward the bright, beautiful sunshine patiently waiting for me outside. Weeks after my visit to Connor, a freezing rainstorm descended upon Atlanta. The sky bruised into a deep gray, unleashing a torrential downpour that flooded the gutters and cleared the bustling sidewalks. From the pristine environment of my executive office on the 40th floor, the storm looked like a silent movie. I stood by the glass nursing hot coffee, watching tiny umbrellas scurry below. My intercom buzzed sharply, breaking the tranquility of my morning. My lead security director informed me that two unwelcome visitors were currently standing on the public sidewalk just beyond the front entrance of my skyscraper. Harrison and Valerie had arrived. They did not arrive in a luxury car. Security cameras showed they arrived on a public city bus. Their spectacular fall from elite society had been swift and absolute. The federal government had seized every remaining asset to satisfy the massive debts they accumulated. The bank had foreclosed on their sprawling Buckhead estate, evicting them with nothing more than the clothes on their backs. Their powerful friends had abandoned them. The prominent church had locked its heavy doors against them. They were currently residing in a notoriously run-down, roach-infested motel located on the ragged outskirts of the sprawling city. They had absolutely nowhere else to turn. I placed my coffee mug on my desk, smoothed my designer suit, and grabbed my coat. I took the private elevator down to the lobby, the smooth descent mirroring the emotional detachment I now felt toward the people who brought me into this world. I stepped through the revolving glass doors and walked out to stand under the structural awning of the Vanguard building. The freezing rain poured down in relentless sheets, instantly soaking the concrete pavement. Harrison and Valerie stood just beyond the dry sanctuary of the awning, fully exposed to the bitter cold. The proud, wealthy patriarch and the high society matriarch were completely gone, replaced by two shivering, broken people. Harrison weakly clutched a cheap plastic umbrella, buckling under the heavy wind. His clothes were soaked through, sticking to his thinning frame. Valerie was wrapped in a faded, waterlogged trench coat, her immaculate hair plastered flat against her shivering face. The expensive makeup she used to apply was washed away, revealing the deep lines of her true age. They stared at me from the rainy sidewalk, their eyes wide with pathetic desperation. My private security detail stepped forward, forming a solid barrier between me and my parents. I raised a single hand, instructing my guards to hold their position. I stepped slightly closer to the edge of the dry awning, looking down at them. "Tiana, please," my mother cried out, her voice barely carrying over the drumming of the torrential rain. "Please, you have to help us. We have absolutely nothing left. The motel room is freezing and we do not have enough money to buy groceries. You are our daughter. We are your flesh and blood. You cannot just leave us out here to suffer like this." Harrison lowered the struggling umbrella, stepping slightly closer to the security line. The old entitlement tried to surface in his voice, but it completely failed, breaking into a desperate wheeze. "We made some terrible mistakes," Harrison begged, shivering violently in the downpour. "But we are completely ruined. The federal prosecutors took everything we owned. We just need a small allowance. A tiny fraction of your wealth could save our lives." I looked at their shivering, wet forms, feeling an immense sense of emptiness. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I simply saw two strangers who were finally experiencing the exact same terrifying vulnerability they had happily inflicted upon me for over 30 years. You are not my family, I stated clearly, my voice carrying a sharp, icy authority that cut right through the noisy storm. You are just two greedy, manipulative strangers who tried to sacrifice my future to fund your own superficial vanity. When you illegally drained my college tuition fund, you did not care if I suffered. When you tried to steal my childhood home, you did not care if I ended up sleeping on the street. You only care about family loyalty now because you are completely out of options. I reached into the deep pocket of my tailored coat and pulled out a crisp white envelope. I held it between my manicured fingers, stepping right up to the invisible boundary where the dry pavement met the pouring rain. Valerie's tired eyes instantly locked onto the white envelope. A desperate spark of greedy hope flashed across her wet face. She believed her pathetic tears had somehow managed to manipulate me one last time. She thought I was handing her a generous check to rescue them from poverty. I slowly extended my arm, holding the envelope out toward her. Valerie eagerly reached through the freezing rain, her trembling fingers snatching the paper from my hand. She ripped the sealed flap open, ignoring the rain. She reached inside and pulled out the contents. Her hopeful expression instantly shattered into a mask of pure devastation. She stared down at the single, crumpled $1 bill resting in her palm. Tucked behind the dollar was a small piece of premium cardstock. The rain quickly blurred the ink, but the printed words were still perfectly legible. Valerie read the short note aloud, her voice breaking into a dry, agonizing sob. For the failed bookkeeper. She dropped her hands, the single-dollar bill fluttering away into the dirty gutter. She looked up at me, her face twisting in profound, unbearable agony. Harrison stared at the falling dollar, his jaw trembling uncontrollably as the finality of my rejection destroyed his remaining spirit. They were now permanently cut off. I did not offer them another word. I turned my back on their weeping figures and walked toward the waiting door of my luxury Maybach. I stepped inside the warm vehicle, completely severing my ties to their miserable existence forever. The smooth hum of the Maybach engine provided a soundtrack as my driver navigated the Atlanta rain. I watched the blurred city lights streak past the windows, leaving the figures of Harrison and Valerie far behind me. The heavy knot of obligation that had weighed down my chest for decades was gone. I leaned back into the plush leather seat, taking a deep breath. When the luxury vehicle glided into the parking garage of my high-rise building, my security team was waiting. They escorted me to the private elevator reserved for the penthouse. The sleek metal doors shut, and I ascended toward the top of the city. I stepped out and walked directly into my multi-million-dollar sanctuary. The living space featured marble floors, velvet furnishings, and a view of the metropolis below. I unbuttoned my cashmere coat, handed it to my assistant, and walked toward the glass wine cellar. I selected a red wine, poured a glass, and made my way toward the sliding glass doors. I pressed a button on the wall panel, and the glass panels slid open silently. I stepped out onto the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the night air feeling refreshing. The lights of the Atlanta skyline stretched out before me for miles, an ocean of electric stars. I walked over to the glass railing, resting my hand against the surface. I took a sip of the wine, letting the flavor ground me. Looking down at the city, I allowed myself to reflect on the journey that had brought me to this vantage point. For 33 years, I was the scapegoat of a toxic family. I was the invisible daughter they used as a punching bag to elevate their insecurities. They mocked my clothes, belittled my intelligence, and tried to strip away my dignity to feed their egos. They believed my silence meant I was weak. They confused my focus with submission. But my silence was never a sign of surrender. It was the incubator of my success. While Kiara chased social status and spent my stolen college tuition on designer handbags, I was pulling 80-hour work weeks. While Harrison and Valerie played dress-up for their church friends, I was studying corporate law, mastering financial algorithms, and building a crisis management empire from the ground up. Every insult they hurled simply added another brick to the fortress I was constructing in the shadows. I took another sip of my wine, savoring the perfection of my strategic revenge. I did not just defeat my family, I dismantled the foundation of their existence. I used their greed, arrogance, and need for social validation as the weapons of their destruction. Connor thought his white privilege and fabricated old money pedigree gave him the right to walk into my life and steal my grandmother's legacy. Instead, he walked into a federal trap that stripped him of his freedom and his dignity. He is currently sitting in a concrete cell, abandoned by the wealthy mistress he thought would save him. Kiara lost her fake aristocratic husband, her stolen social standing, and her entire false identity in a single evening. She is facing a mountain of debt with zero marketable skills to survive in the real world. Harrison and Valerie, the elitist architects of my childhood misery, are currently freezing in a roach-infested motel, permanently exiled from the high society they worshipped. I did not just beat them at their own game. I obliterated the playing field. I reclaimed every dollar they stole from me, multiplied it, and legally secured my financial supremacy. The ringing of my smartphone broke through the quiet ambience of the balcony. I pulled the device from my pocket and glanced at the glowing screen. It was an encrypted call from a prominent United States senator who was facing a massive career-ending public relations scandal. He had been trying to secure the services of Vanguard Crisis Management for the past 3 days. I let the phone ring 3 times, establishing the power dynamic, before I pressed the green button to accept the call. "This is Tiana," I answered, my voice projecting unwavering authority into the receiver. "Miss Vance, thank you so much for taking my call at this late hour." The senator pleaded, his voice trembling with obvious desperation. "My political career is completely falling apart. My current legal team is entirely out of their depth. I urgently need your firm to step in and fix this disaster before the media ruins me completely. I am fully prepared to pay triple your standard retainer fee if you agree to take my case." I looked out over the glowing city skyline, watching the tiny headlights of the cars moving far below me. I held the power to save his career or let him drown in his mistakes. "I will have my executive assistant send over the preliminary contract in the morning, Senator," I replied smoothly. "You will sign it immediately, and you will follow my explicit instructions without question. If you deviate from my strategy for even a second, I will drop your case and leave you to the wolves. Do we have a clear understanding?" "Yes, absolutely," the powerful politician stammered gratefully. "Whatever you say, Tiana. Thank you." I ended the call with the definitive click and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I raised my wine glass, offering a silent, triumphant toast to the beautiful, sprawling city of Atlanta. The girl who used to cry in her pale blue bedroom was permanently erased from existence. I am the billionaire chief executive officer of the most ruthless, effective crisis management firm in the country. I am completely free from the toxic chains of my past. I am wildly successful, fiercely independent, and totally untouchable. I took one final satisfying sip of my wine, turned my back on the glittering city lights, and walked gracefully back inside my luxurious, massive empire.